Well, I'll talk to you a little bit now about the concentration camp. Concentration camps were established, they were established in England, Germany, Russia, China, Cambodia, and Yugoslavia. And in the Soviet Union, the estimates, these are estimates that were derived by Solzhenitsyn, were that 66 million people died in internal repression in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959. That's a figure that's 10 times as great as the figures that are commonly used to describe the genocide rate in the Holocaust, which was more like 6 million. And Solzhenitsyn also estimated, but no one knows, that 100 million people died in China during Mao's Cultural Revolution, when Mao decided that he was going to wipe out all of Chinese tradition and destroyed much of the ancient artifacts that characterized that tradition in a riotous catastrophe that lasted more than a decade. Solzhenitsyn says, the imagination and strength, spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses because they had no ideology. Ideology. That's what gives evil doing its long-sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That's the social theory which helps to make his acts seem good instead of bad in his own eyes and others. This was how the agents of the Inquisition fortified their wills, by invoking Christianity. The conqueror of foreign lands by extolling the grandeur of their motherland. The colonizers by civilization. The Nazis by race. And the Jacobins, early and late, by equality, brotherhood, and the happiness of future generations. Without evildoers, there would have been no archipelago. The archipelago, the Gulag archipelago, is Solzhenitsyn's metaphor for the prison camps, like the prison camps that exist now in North Korea, in which millions of people are starving and dying, for the prison camps that littered the entire Soviet Union. And those cultures became so pathological that in East Germany, for example, before the wall fell down, and East Germany was arguably one of the more civilized parts of the Soviet state, 1 person out of 3 was a government informer. So if you have a family of 5 people, there's a reasonable probability that 2 of them are going to tell a government agent what you say and think. And that was also portrayed as the highest possible moral virtue, because it was much better for you to be an admirable citizen of the state than, say, a loyal daughter. And that's what children were taught in school, that the family was a defunct unit, and that individual relationships were secondary, and that all that mattered was adherence to the dogma that constituted the central axioms of the state. This is Solzhenitsyn's description of how communist ideological uniformity was enforced in the prison camps. An anonymous author is told how executions were carried out at Adak, a camp on the Pechora River. They would take the opposition members with their things out of the camp compound on a prisoner transport at night, and outside the compound stood the small house of the 3rd section. The condemned men were taken into a room one at a time, and there the camp guards sprang on them. Their mouths were stuffed with something soft, and their arms were bound with cords behind their backs. Then they were led out into the courtyard where harnessed carts were waiting. The bound prisoners were piled on the carts, from 5 to 7 at a time, and driven off to the Gorka, the camp cemetery. On arrival, they were tipped into big pits that had already been prepared and buried alive. Not out of brutality. No. It had been ascertained that when dragging and lifting them, it was much easier to cope with living people than with corpses. The work went on for many nights at Adak, and that is how the moral political unity of our party was achieved. If you have a rigid belief system, and that's what an ideology is, because its axioms are such that it encompasses all of reality, and then there are details left outside that don't seem to fit into that reality, well, then you ignore them. But what if they're embodied? What if they're people who are objecting to the way you think? Well, the equivalent to repressing evidence that runs contrary to your theory is the murder of people who object to what you say. And those two things are linked much tighter than you would think. You know, you might think, well, I would never do something like the communists did in the evangelization of my beliefs. But the truth of the matter is that in general, people will do such things if they're granted the opportunity and provided with the proper apparatus. This is Frankl from his accounts of the concentration camps under Nazi Germany. The most ghastly moment of the 24 hours of camp life was the awakening, when, at a still nocturnal hour, the 3 shrill blows of a whistle tore us pitilessly from our exhausted sleep and from the longings in our dreams. We then began the tussle with our wet shoes, into which we could scarcely force our feet, which were sore and swollen with edema. And then there were the usual moans and groans about petty troubles, such as the snapping of wires which replaced shoelaces. One morning I heard someone, whom I knew to be brave and dignified, cry like a child, because he finally had to go out to the snowy marching fields in his bare feet, as his shoes were too shrunken for him to wear. In those ghastly moments, I found a little bit of comfort, a small piece of bread, which I drew out of my pocket and munched with absorbed delight. Solzhenitsyn. Many of the gulag camps contained 2 classes of prisoners. Rapists, murderers, and thieves were very well organized in Russia and the Soviet Union, and political prisoners. And because the Soviets believed that the reason that people were thieves, murderers, and rapists was because of the appalling sociological conditions that they grew up into, they believed they were socially friendly elements who could still be redeemed. So they put them in charge of the camps. And so the political prisoners were at the bottom of the hierarchy. The prisoners ran the camps with minimal supervision. And the camps were often forced labor camps. And forced labor meant do something difficult and pointless until you die. It meant only secondarily produce something of potential value to the state. You saw this with Nazi Germany too. The Nazis, when they started to lose the Second World War, they could have stopped their Holocaust machinations and used the people they had imprisoned to build implements to further the war effort, which they did to some degree, so they could have used them as slaves. So this would be the logic. Take the slaves, make the munitions, win the war. Then, after you've won the war, you can run around and mop everybody up. But that isn't what the Nazis did. When they started to lose, instead of doing what you think would be rational in the pursuit of what was hypothetically their goal, they amped up the killing and took resources away from the war itself. And so the conclusion that's reasonable to draw from that is that the killing was the purpose of the war. All the rest of it was just window dressing. And exactly as Solzhenitsyn described in the earlier quotes that I told you, was that ideology was only there to allow the people who were fundamentally motivated towards genocide and destruction to pretend to themselves that they hadn't become rotten to the absolute core. But when push came to shove and they had to show where their allegiances lie, they weren't even valid followers of the Nazi Party, because they put the continued pursuit of death above their own survival, even as an ideology. And that's how ideology degenerates. And part of the reason for that is that the narrower the box that you stuff yourself into, the weaker your character becomes. Because there's nothing left of you. You're just a shell that has demons in it. But you're still the sort of thing that can suffer. And so if you cram everything you are into a box, a small, tight box, and you get rid of everything that doesn't fit, you get rid of everything in you that makes life bearable. And then life becomes unbearable. And then if life becomes unbearable, well then, of course, you're motivated to do nothing but to take revenge on it. Because why wouldn't you? If all you were doing was suffering stupidly and meaninglessly, how could you possibly show a positive face to yourself and to the rest of humanity? In cold lower than 60 degrees below zero, work days were written off. In other words, on such days, the records showed that the workers had not gone out to work. They were often digging canals on the frozen Siberian prairie by hand. There was one canal, I think it was on the Volga River, but I can't remember precisely. Stalin killed 300,000 people in a single winter, digging it by hand. And when it was done, it was so shallow that no ships could use it. The record showed that the workers had not gone out to work, but they chased them out anyway, and whatever they squeezed out of them on those days was added to the other days, thereby raising the percentages. And the servile medical section wrote off those who froze to death on such cold days on some other basis. And the ones who were left, who could no longer walk and were straining every sinew to crawl along on all fours on the way back to camp, the convoy simply shot so that they wouldn't escape before they could come back to get them. This is from William Blake. O Rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night, in the howling storm, hath found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. This is Solzhenitsyn. Fire, fire. The branches crackle and the night wind of late autumn blows the flame of the bonfire back and forth. The compound is dark. I'm alone at the bonfire, and I can bring it still some more carpenter's shavings. This compound here is a privileged one. So privileged that it's almost as if I were out in freedom. This is an island of paradise. This is the Marfino Sharashka, a scientific institute staffed by engineers, staffed with prisoners, in its most privileged period. No one is overseeing me, calling me to a cell, chasing me away from the bonfire. And even then, it is chilly in the penetrating wind. But she, who has already been standing in the wind for hours, her arms straight down, her head drooping, weeping, and then growing numb and still. And then again she begs piteously, "Citizen Chief, please forgive me. I won't do it again." The wind carries her moan to me, just as if she were moaning next to my ear. The Citizen Chief at the gatehouse fires up his stove and does not answer. This was the gatehouse of the camp next door to us, from which workers came into our compound to lay water pipes and repair the old ramshackle seminary building. Across from me, beyond the artfully intertwined, many-stranded barbed wire barricade, and 2 steps away from the gatehouse, beneath a bright lantern, stood the punished girl, head hanging, the wind tugging at her gray work skirt, her feet growing numb from the cold, and a thin scarf over her head. It had been warm during the day when they had been digging a ditch on our territory. And another girl, slipping down into a ravine, had crawled her way to the Vladikino highway and escaped. The guard had bungled. And Moscow city buses ran right along the highway. When they caught on, it was too late to catch her. They raised the alarm. A mean, dark major arrived and shouted that if they failed to catch the girl, the entire camp would be deprived of visits and parcels for a whole month because of her escape. And the women brigadiers went into a rage, and they were all shouting, one of them in particular, who kept viciously rolling her eyes. "Oh, I hope they catch her, the bitch. I hope they take scissors and clip, clip, take off all her hair in front of the lineup." This wasn't something she had thought up herself. This is the way they punished women in the gulag. But the girl who was now standing outside the gatehouse in the cold had sighed and said instead, "At least she can have a good time out in freedom for all of us." The jailer overheard what she said, and now she was being punished. Everyone else had been taken off to the camp, but she had been set outside there to stand at attention in front of the gatehouse. This had been at 6 p.m., and it was now 11 p.m. She tried to shift from one foot to another, but the guard struck out his head and shouted, "Stand at attention, whore, or it will be worse for you." And now she was not moving, only weeping. "Forgive me, Citizen Chief. Let me into the camp. I won't do it anymore." But even in the camp, no one was about to say to her, "All right, idiot, come on in." The reason they were keeping her out there so long was that the next day was Sunday, and she would not be needed for work. Such a straw blonde, naive, uneducated slip of a girl. She had been imprisoned for some spool of thread. What a dangerous thought you expressed there, little sister. They want to teach you a lesson for the rest of your life. Fire, fire. We fought the war. And we looked into the bonfires to see what kind of victory it would be. The wind wafted a glowing husk from the bonfire. To that flame in you, girl, I promise the whole wide world will read about you. From Milton. This is from Paradise Lost. Milton wrote Paradise Lost just before the rise of the nation states, and Milton also had the intuition that there was something wrong with rationality, and he identified rationality with the mythology of Satan. And in the mythology of Satan, Satan was represented as the highest angel in God's heavenly kingdom. So you can think about that as the highest psychological function, who had rebelled against God and was then cast into hell. And the idea, there's an idea that's being expressed by Milton. He was one of the foremost poetic geniuses of the English language, Milton and Shakespeare. And what Milton was trying to understand was, what is the nature of evil? And his representation gathered up the dreamlike theories of evil that had been collected around all of Western civilization for thousands of years. And his hypothesis was this: evil is the force that believes that its knowledge is complete and that it can do without the transcendent. And as soon as it makes that claim, it instantly exists in a place that's indistinguishable from hell. And it could get out merely by admitting its error, and it will never do that. For whence but from the author of all ill could spring so deep a malice, to confound the race of mankind in one root, and earth with hell to mingle and involve, done all to spite the great Creator. This is from Richard III, Shakespeare. I shall despair, there is no creature loves me, and if I die, no soul will pity me. Nay, wherefore should they, since that I myself find in myself no pity to myself. Solzhenitsyn describes the reactions and actions of Communist Party members who were devoured by the system, because that often happened. The prison system, the gulag system, was very indiscriminating. You could land there for good reasons or bad, and the bad reasons were probably better, because the punishment was more severe if you were imprisoned for your innocence. And Communist Party members often got vacuumed up, and this was ontologically and existentially intolerable for them, because they'd committed their whole soul to the ideological dogma, and then its tyrannical aspect picked them up and destroyed them like they were worth nothing. To say that things were painful for them is to say almost nothing. They were incapable of assimilating such a blow, such a downfall, and from their own people too, from their own dear party. The typical arrest was, you're at home with your family, in your bed, and it's 3 o'clock in the morning. And the door's kicked down, and they take you out of your bed in whatever you happen to be wearing, and they tell you to say goodbye to your family and give you like 25 seconds to pack, and then you're gone, and no one sees you again. They take you to the prison, they take off all your clothes, they shave your head, they have you pick out some random clothes from a pile of clothes, hopefully they don't fit, and then you're tried, you confess, if you will, and you're off to the prison camp. To say that things were painful for them is to say almost nothing. They were incapable of assimilating such a blow, such a downfall, and from their own people too, from their own dear party, and from all appearances for nothing at all. After all, they had been guilty of nothing as far as the party was concerned, nothing at all. It was painful to them to such a degree that it was considered taboo among them, uncomradely, to ask, what were you imprisoned for? Ha! They were the only squeamish generation of prisoners. The rest of us, with our tongues hanging out, couldn't wait to tell the story to every chance newcomer we met, and to the whole cell, as if it were an anecdote. Here's the sort of people they were. Olga Sliosberg's husband had already been arrested, and they had come to carry out a search and arrest her too. The search lasted 4 hours, and she spent those 4 hours sorting out the minutes of the Congress of the bristle and brush industry, of which she had been the secretary until the previous day. The incomplete state of the minutes troubled her more than her children, who she was now leaving forever. Even the interrogator conducting the search could not resist telling her, come on now, say farewell to your children. Here's the sort of people they were. A letter from her 15-year-old daughter came to Yelizaveta Tsetkova in the Kazan prison for long-term prisoners. Mama, tell me, write to me, are you guilty or not? I hope you weren't guilty, because then I won't join the Komsomol, which was the young communists organization, and I won't forgive them because of you. But if you're guilty, I won't write you anymore, and I will hate you. And the mother was stricken by remorse in her damp, grave-like cell with its dim little lamp. How could her daughter live without the Komsomol? How could she be permitted to hate Soviet power? Better that she should hate me. And so she wrote, I am guilty, enter the Komsomol. How could it be anything but hard? It was more than the human heart could bear to fall beneath the beloved axe, and then to have to justify its wisdom. But that's the price a man pays for entrusting his God-given soul to human dogma. Even today, any Orthodox communist will affirm that Tsetkova acted correctly. Even today, they cannot be convinced that this is precisely, quote, the perversion of small forces, that the mother perverted her daughter and harmed her soul. Here's the sort of people they were. YT gave sincere testimony against her husband. Anything to aid the party. Oh, how one could pity them. If they at least had come to comprehend their former wretchedness, this whole chapter could have been written quite differently if today at least they had forsaken their earlier views. But it happened the way Maria Danielin had dreamed it would. If I leave here someday, I am going to live as if nothing had taken place. Loyalty? In our view, it's just plain pig-headedness. Those devotees to the theories of development construed loyalty to that development to mean renunciation to any personal development whatsoever. As Nikolai Adamovich Vilenchuk said after serving 17 years, we believed in the party and we were not mistaken. Is this loyalty or pig-headedness? No, it was not for show and not out of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy that they argued in the cells in defense of all the government's actions. They needed ideological arguments in order to hold on to a sense of their own rightness. Otherwise, insanity was not far off. This is from Paradise Lost. So, in this scene, Satan is cast into hell, and it's because of his rebellion against the transcendent, his idea that he himself is sufficient. This is his statement to his crew. Farewell, happy fields, where joy forever dwells. Hail, horrors. Hail, infernal world, and thou profundest hell. Receive thy new possessor. One who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, or hell of heaven. What matters where, if I be still the same, and what I should be, all but less than he whom thunder hath made greater? Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice. To reign is worth ambition, though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. The existentialists of the late 19th century attempted to diagnose the pathology of the human personality at a deeper level, I believe, than anyone else had ever attempted. And their fundamental conclusion was that the destruction by rationality of the evolved systems of meaning that people had previously lived within had undermined the psychological strength of each individual, divorced from their own history. That led them to gravitate towards either nihilism or, as a counterposition, to gravitate towards totalitarianism. The whole 20th century played out the pendulum swing between nihilism and totalitarianism. And in the background, the existentialists and the psychodynamic theorists were putting forward a theory which was that if people lived up to their own possibility and held on to their own experience as if it were true and did not substitute for that ideological and consensual beliefs, that it would be possible for each person to find a wellspring of meaning that would be a sufficient replacement for what had been lost historically without having to fall into the pitfalls of nihilism or totalitarianism. And so you might say, well, nihilism, well, that's one thing because mostly that affects you, although if you're nihilistic then everyone around you is going to be pulled down as well. But totalitarianism is a whole different issue because what we know now is that once things become ideologically totalitarian, the next step is mass murder. And the next step is mass murder in a manner that makes it appear that the purpose for the ideological rigidification to begin with was the opportunity to participate in mass murder. So you know how Hitler died. Hitler lost faith in the German people because they were losing the war. And so he concluded in the waning stages of World War II that Germany should just be destroyed in fire and everything else that he could possibly consume would go with him. And so he died in a bunker underneath Berlin. When it was in flames, he committed suicide. When Europe was in flames. And Hitler was a worshipper of the kind of fire that purifies. He used that mythology of cleansing fire to enter into a terrible pact with the entire nation that he followed and led. And Stalin didn't just kill individuals that he pulled off the streets. He killed like all the engineers and all the doctors because he believed they were wreckers. They killed all the good farmers. They killed 6 million Ukrainians. They moved whole nations of people into Siberia and let them die. And there's every bit of evidence there is suggests that what Stalin was doing was practicing murderous genocide on an ever larger scale and hoping that it would culminate in a thermonuclear war. And we escaped that just by a thread. The existentialists make the claim, which I think is a remarkable and powerful claim, that the way out of those catastrophic situations is not through political action per se, or it's not going to be resolved by one party defeating another or one position defeating another. That's a continuation of the same process that produces the problem. The existential and the psychodynamic answer to this problem is that it's more a disease of the soul than a disease of the state. And that the way to address it is to ensure that you live in a manner that makes you neither nihilistic nor susceptible to ideological possession. Solzhenitsyn and other thinkers like him, like Frankl, believed that society was a macrocosm of the individual. Not the other way around, not that the individual is a sub-element of society. Believed that the choice that each individual made was potentially so powerful in relationship to pathological behavior or honest and thoughtful behavior that a single individual properly developed could stand up against a tyranny and win. And it seems to me, and I've thought about this for a very long time, that the lesson of the 20th century is that a single individual can stand up against a tyrant and win. And each of us are single individuals. And the danger of tyranny and the danger of nihilism are not past. And so, as inheritors of the catastrophic legacy of the 20th century, and as inhabitants of the new millennium, part of your responsibility is to live your own life, and to live it honestly, and to pay attention to your own experience, and not take the easy way out that ideological systems offer you. They're destined to transform themselves into rigid and murderous pathologies. And you offload your responsibility for thinking and acting to them. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what are they? Well, all the evidence suggests that they're not the sort of thing that you want to have in your head. The grades are up. We'll see you on Tuesday.